Hello. In this video, we'll be going through retired shares versus treasury stock. Let's look at the components of the shareholders' equity section on the balance sheet first and what they include. And they include the paid-in capital account, which will be the common stock, preferred stock, and the paid-in capital. We have a retained earnings account. We may have treasury stock, and we may have accumulated other comprehensive income. Companies may choose to repurchase their shares that they've previously sold. So they've sold it and now they're going to buy it back. And the reason why a corporation might do that is because they feel that their stock is undervalued. And so by decreasing the supply that's out in the marketplace, it might drive up demand, which will drive up the stock price. When a company purchases its own shares, it's not viewed as an asset. So usually when we acquire, another company's share, it's an investment and we debit an investment account, which is an asset. When we acquire our own or repurchase our own shares, it's not an asset. We'll go through all those entries in a couple of minutes. But it's also when a company repurchases its own shares, it's a way to distribute quote unquote company profits without actually paying a dividend. And this goes back to the first bullet point that if they decrease the supply, the demand goes up, right? And then the price goes up. And if the price of the shares go up, then every shareholder that already owns those shares before they repurchased, their investment in each share goes up, and therefore it's kind of like distributing the company profits without actually paying a dividend. And sometimes a company will also repurchase shares because to offset the increase in shares that they've issued to employees as a part of their overall compensation. So oftentimes companies, in addition to their cash compensation, they'll give employees either stock options, stock restricted stock. There's just different types of stock compensation that can happen that exist. And so then when they do that, then that dilutes the shares outstanding. And so the company might buy back some of their shares. So therefore, again, it'll increase the price that by issuing the stock compensation actually decrease the price because it increased the supply. So it kind of to offset that, they might repurchase their own shares. So there's two ways that a company can repurchase, or we also call buy back their own shares. They can buy back their shares as treasury stock, which means that they intend to hold those shares, but at some point in the future, they will again reissue those same shares, or they can actually be formally retired. So they buy back their shares and those particular shares are never reissued. Let's go through an example in Excel, and I think it'll make more sense as to how we account for retired shares and retired versus treasury shares. Let's go first through the examples of retiring shares, which means that a company repurchases their own shares, but they will never be reissued. Those same shares will never be reissued. So here are some assumptions that we're going to make. And let me just make this slightly bigger. Okay. So here's the assumptions. This company is repurchasing and retiring 1,000 shares. The par value per share was $1, and the original issue price, which is really important, is $10 per share. And this is our shareholders' equity section before we retire them. We have common stock for $10,000, paid-in capital in excess of par for $90,000. Paid-in capital for share repurchase is $500. If you're not familiar with how we account for treasury stock, please go back and watch that video because that's how these paid-in capital share repurchase accounts can come about. And we have retained earnings for $2,000, so total equity is $102,500. So in this situation, we are repurchasing the entire 1,000 shares below the original price. So the original price was 10, and now we were repurchasing at 8. So we're paying out $8,000 to buy those shares back. So here is how we are going to account for it. First, let's look at row 28, the cash. We're going to credit cash for $8,000 because we paid $8,000. Just quick note, if in case you haven't noticed by my previous videos, whenever I do journal entries, I kind of just I try to start with the most obvious part of the entries so that if you're in an exam and you're not really sure even where to start, always start with what you know, because it'll just kind of help you build that journal entry. So we're going to credit cash for $2,000. Now we are officially retiring these shares. So what we have to do is when we booked these shares, when we acquired those shares, it was $1 par, right? And then the paid in capital in excess of par was $9 because we had 10,000 shares at $1. So we had 10,000 shares at $9 we had 10,000 shares where $9 of it was above par. So we have to take off of our books the amount that we originally booked them for. So originally we booked, that 1,000 shares times a $1 par. It was $1,000. So now we have to debit our common stock and we have to debit our paid in capital in excess of par for the original amount, which would be $9,000. So if you take the common stock and paid in capital in excess of par, here you'll see very, very tiny. Oh, it disappeared, but then 1 plus 9 is the $10,000 that we originally booked those 1,000 shares for, so now we have to remove them. And we've booked the 8,000, so now we have a plug, okay? This plug is going to be paid in capital share repurchase, right? So now we're going to add to this $500 another $2,000 credit balance. Let's look at our stockholders' equity before and after. So this column right here, the before purchase, we have our stockholders' equity at 102,500. I booked all my adjustments. I reduced my common stock by 1,000, reduced my paid in capital excess of par by 1,000, increased my paid in capital share repurchase by 2,000. And so now here on this column to the right on column D, we have all our new balances. Notice that before our repurchase, our equity section was 102,500. After the retirement, it's 94,500. This is really important to just take notice because we are officially retiring these shares. They are no longer, these particular shares are no longer going to be sold versus if we account for as treasury shares, they are going to be sold, and you'll see the difference when we go through that. Okay, now let's go through an example. We just went through an example where we repurchased the shares below the original price. Now let's see what happens when we repurchase them above the original price. And I want to do a comparison side by side, but first let's just I'm going to keep it like this. So now we repurchased 1,000 shares at $12, right? Which is above the original price of 10. So we paid cash of 12,000. So here I'm going to credit cash $12,000. This is the same thing because whether you repurchase the shares below or above the original price or at the original price, you have to remove the common stock and paid in capital in excess of par accounts for the amounts you originally booked. So we're still going to have a debit to common stock for 1,000 and a debit to paid in capital in excess of par for $9,000. Here's what the difference between below and above the original price comes right here. Part of it. When you repurchase the shares above the original price, we are just going to remove the paid in capital share repurchase that is existing on our equity section. So here we can see our equity section, and we had in row 15, this paid in capital share repurchase, we had a balance of 500. And so we're going to debit that account to get rid of it. And then the retained earnings ends up being a plug, right? Because our entry needs to balance, and so it's going to be a plug to retained earnings, and that could be a debit or credit depending on which way the numbers go. So that's the biggest difference between when we repurchase and retire our shares below original price or above original price. Now let's just look at our equity section before and after. Right here, here's our before we repurchased it. There's the 102,500, and we recording all our adjustments, all our entries to each of the equity accounts. And now we get our new equity balance, and the total is $90,500. Okay, so now we see our equity section still is reduced, still decreased, which is what we expect, but it decreased by more because we had to pay more out for those shares. So it decreased by more. So that's just comparing the share retirement, right? Whether you have you repurchase those shares below market price, below the original price, and above the original price. Here we are in the next tab, and in case you can't see it, this side on the left is we're looking at how we account for retirement of repurchase shares, and on this side is treasury stock. So I just want to make that very clear which side is what's what. We're going to have the same assumption for both sides, right? We are repurchasing and retiring 1,000 shares, $1 par value, and the original issue price was $10. On this right-hand side, the assumptions are, the only difference is that the shares are being repurchased but not retired. You can see I capitalized that. Everything else remains the same. Our shareholders' equity section for is the same for both. We're going to see what happens to each the shareholders' equity for each scenario. And we're going to, let's start with the retirement, where we retire it before we retired below the original price at $8. These are the same entries we just went through, right? Where we had to remove the common stock that we originally paid for, sold it at, and then we paid out cash $8,000, and our plug was to this paid in capital share repurchase. For treasury stock, we still paid out the $8,000, but now we're not actually retiring them. We're just holding them, and we will reissue them at some point. Now we have treasury stock. We debit treasury stock for $8,000, and that will reduce our shareholders' equity section. If you're not familiar with this entry, please go view this another video just specifically on treasury stock, where I go into details to how to account for all the treasury stock transactions. So now let's look at our shareholders' equity before and after for each scenario. Our shareholders' equity scenario for retirement, here we have the same before, the 102,500, and I record all my adjustments for this repurchase of the shares in retirement for $8,000. And now I have my below price retirement, right? And my shareholders' equity is $94,500. If I go over to the right and I do the same thing, I have my before repurchase 102,500. The treasury stock reduces my shareholders' equity, and so my overall shareholders' equity is the same as if I retired at 94,500, but the individual balances within the shareholders' equity are different than the retirement. Okay, so now let's just go and look at, we repurchased 1,000 shares, and now we issue new shares. We issue 200 new shares, okay? Well, under the retirement scenario, we have retired those shares completely. We are never reissuing those same shares. So this would be any issuance of new shares would be accounted for in the same manner as you would always account for it when you sell shares. So if we issue 200 shares at $9, we would get $1,800. So we debit cash $1,800. We would credit common stock for the number of shares sold multiplied by the par value, which in this scenario is $1. So we credit common stock for $200, and then the rest goes paid in capital common stock in excess of par, okay, for $1,600. Treasury stock is going to be different because we are reissuing those shares that we previously purchased. Okay, notice here on row 61 for the retirement, I just said issue 200 shares, and under the treasury stock it says reissue 200 shares. We are now reselling those shares that we previously bought back right here for $8. We are now reissuing them at $9, the 200 of those shares. So same, we still get $1,800 because we're selling those shares for $1,800. So we're going to debit cash for $1,800. But now we are going to remove the treasury stock because we're reissuing them, but we have to remove them at the price that we purchase them at. And so if you go up here, we purchased those shares, those treasury stock shares at $8. So we have to remove them at $8. So we're going to take the 200 shares that we're reselling times 8 is $1,600. So we're going to credit the treasury stock for $1,600 because when we purchased the treasury stock, we created a debit for the treasury stock account. So to get rid of, when we sell those treasury stock back out into the open market, we have to credit that account. And then we have a plug to paid in capital share repurchase. That's going to be a plug for $200. Let's go through one more step, and that's that we've issued 700 shares at $15. Well, under retirement, it's no different than no matter what price you issue those shares at. And because we previously retired those shares, right? So now anytime we issue more shares, they're brand new shares. So we count for them just like you would normally whenever you issue stock. So we got 700 shares at $15 is $10,500. So we receive cash for that amount. So we debit cash. We're going to credit our common stock account for the number of shares sold multiplied by the par value. So 700 shares times $1. So we're going to credit it for $700. And our paid in capital common stock in excess of par is going to be a plug for $9,800. Let's move over to the treasury stock side. And now, again, we're reissuing our 700 shares because we've repurchased them and we said sometime in the future we're going to resell them, which is the same thing as reissue. So now 700 shares reissued at $15, $10,500. Our journal entry, we still received cash for that amount. So we're going to debit cash, $10,500. We have to now remove our treasury stock from our balance sheet because we're reissuing them back out into the open market. And when we do that, we have to credit that account for the same amount that we initially recorded it at, which was when we bought those 1,000 shares at $8. So now when we reissue 700 of those 1,000 shares, we're going to remove it at $8. So 700 times 8 is we're going to credit our treasury stock account for $5,600. Next, we also have to look to see if we have a paid in capital share repurchase amount in our accounts, and we do. So this gets kind of tricky, and usually if you look at my treasury stock video, I'll tell you that it's really, really important to keep track of your paid in capital share repurchase account in a T account because there could be several debits and credits going through there. But let's look at the balance in our paid in capital repurchase account. We had our original shareholders equity snapshot that we were given, and we have a paid in capital share repurchase account for $500. Now that is a credit balance for $500 because this is the shareholders equity section and its normal balance is a credit. So it a credit for $500, but then when we reissue those treasury shares at $9, we credited that same account by 200. So now we have a total credit of 700, which is why we're going to debit that account here for 700. We're going to zero it out for the whatever that credit balance is. We're going to just reverse it, and then the plug, the entry would not that entry, right, if I just left it like that, it wouldn't balance because I would have debits of 11,200 and credit of 5,600. So my credit is going to be retained earnings as a plug. Happens to be it's the same amount as treasury stock for $5,600. That's just coincidental how the numbers worked out. But again, if you're not familiar with what is happening right here, please go back to the Treasury stock video. Let's do a concept check. The balance sheet of Chun Industries included the following shareholders' equity section at December 31st, 2027. We're told that our common stock and paid, I'm just gonna let you look at the snapshot of the total shareholders' equity section. And we're told that on January 5th, 2028, Chun purchased and retired 1 million shares for $9 million. Immediately after the purchase of the shares, the balances in the paid-in capital and excess of par and retained accounts are what? So this is really key because it's telling us that Chun, which is the corporation, purchased and retired. If it told us that it was purchased as and intended to hold on to it, then it would be a treasury stock situation. So it's really important you know, are we talking about retiring share buyback or treasury stock share buyback? So in this example, it's retired. So let's go through some calculations. First, we're told on 12/31/27, we have common stock, $1 par value, and we have issued and outstanding 90 million shares. So here's $90 million. So they took the 90 million shares divided by, I took $90 that we were given to figure out the par value, even though that was also provided here. Okay, but we also need to know this paid in capital in excess of par account right here, this $540 million. What was the amount per share that we recorded for that $540,000? So let's look at that. Again, we're going to take our 90 million shares outstanding divided by what we were given is the total for the paid-in capital. So meaning we booked $6 above par for each of those 90 million shares. So right here, we know that these shares were booked for $7 per share. When they were first sold, we sold them for $7 per share, okay? Or yeah, that's what it was. $1 went to common stock and the rest went to the paid-in capital. So now we can account for when we retire this 1 million shares, we have to reverse the amount that was recorded to common stock and the paid-in capital for those 1 million shares originally. So we have 1 million shares for $9. So we have to remove the common stock. So we're going to do $1 par value times the 1 million shares that we're retiring. So we're going to debit common stock for $1. And the paid-in capital in excess of par, we're retiring 1 million shares, and this is where that $6 comes in. That's why we had to do this math right here to figure this out right here, okay? So we're going to debit paid-in capital for $6. We're going to credit cash for $9 million because we paid to repurchase these shares 1 million times 9, or well, I guess he told us $9 million. So credit cash $9 million and retained earnings a debit, and that's a plug. So now let's look at what the question is actually asking us. The question asks us immediately after the purchase of the shares, we need to know the balance in the paid-in capital and the retained earnings. Well, let's look. Here's our entry right here. Okay. We had a debit to paid-in capital for $6. So a debit reduces our balance. So we take the 540 minus 6 equals 534. And we had a debit to retained earnings for $2. So we take the 280 minus 2 equals $278, which is how the answer is C.